Hey guys, hope you're having a good weekend if you have the day off. Hope you're having a good fourth weekend. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the basics of climate change, like the basic scientific facts and issues related to climate change. And the reason I wanted to do this is because the way the media is, they give us the impression that there's some valid or legitimate controversy related to what climate change is. And also the media, the corporate media that are not representative of free speech and do not speak in our best interest, do not get the facts and do not investigate the people that they need to be investigating. The corporate media make it seem like there's some valid and legitimate controversy, and also that maybe we have decades, that climate change is something that our grandchildren will have to deal with. That is a false, misleading, and it's a false and misleading impression to get, that climate change is something our grandchildren will have to deal with. In point of fact, it is something that has already been occurring, has already had catastrophic effects, and will only continue, the catastrophic effects will only continue to double and redouble as time goes on. So what we want to do is just, have some of the basic facts in mind for those times when some person or media outlet makes it seem like reasonable people can differ on this. So fact number one is that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was 280 parts per million prior to the Industrial Revolution. So if you roll back the clock to the late 1700s, we know that the carbon in the atmosphere was approximately 280 parts per million. We know that the carbon in the atmosphere now is approximately 410 parts per million. So it has increased about 50%. So that's just here. There's a fact that we know. Whoever is doubting the veracity, the truthness of climate change, what are they going on? Another fact is that we've known for 150 years that carbon is a greenhouse gas, that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, that to the extent there is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it tends to take a little bit of the sun's energy, and it takes a little bit of the sunlight and converts it into heat. So we've known that for 150 years. So far we're just talking about science, the amount of carbon that was in the atmosphere prior to the Industrial Revolution, the amount of carbon that is in the atmosphere now. So it's gone from 280 parts per million to 410 parts per million. We also know that the amount of carbon that has been released into the atmosphere, about half of the carbon that is now in the atmosphere due to human causes has been released in the last 30 years. So 30 years ago was when James Hansen, NASA scientist James Hansen, testified before Congress that global warming is a thing, that there is a greenhouse effect, that this greenhouse effect is caused by humans. And so we've known that officially for the last 30 years. Prior to that, the oil company scientists knew that for the 15 or 20 years prior to that. Plus, it's only common sense. If carbon is a greenhouse gas, and if we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere, and if the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is going up over time, and we know approximately how much a carbon molecule is going to generate heat when light hits it, then what is not scientific about this? And then you have irresponsible media sources and charlatans that will plant in people's minds the idea that, well, there's a certain amount of carbon that is released naturally, and natural processes are going to reabsorb a certain amount of carbon. But we know that the net amount of carbon is going up. We know that the net that the carbon that is in the atmosphere is heating the planet at an unusual rate, and this is a problem. So what are some of the problems that have been caused? Well, first, how much have temperatures risen? So temperatures have risen approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius worldwide. That's a global average. I noticed Jim Kidwell is joining me. Hi, Jim. We're talking about what are the basic scientific facts related to climate change. I mean, if you have 2 or 3 minutes or 5 minutes to orient someone as to what's really going on with climate change, then what do you say? So we know how much carbon dioxide was in the atmosphere prior to the Industrial Revolution, about 250 years ago. We know how much there is now. We know that it's caused by humans. We know that the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is there because of humans. We know that the net amount of carbon dioxide is increasing at a rate, well, I don't know about the rate per year. We do know the rate per year. We know that about half of the human-generated carbon dioxide has occurred within the last 30 years. In other words, it has occurred since we have known officially from NASA scientist James Hansen, since we have known officially from James Hansen, the amount of human-generated carbon has just about doubled in the last 30 years, and it's going to continue to redouble. So far, the amount of temperature increase in terms of a global average, the temperature has increased by a global average of about 1.1 degrees Celsius. That's about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So we know that. So far we're only talking about science. The fact that carbon is a greenhouse gas. The fact that we know how much carbon was in the atmosphere prior to the Industrial Revolution, how much there is now. And let's talk a little bit about the effects of human-generated carbon dioxide. One thing is that it's causing the ice to melt. It only stands to reason that if global average temperatures have increased by 2 degrees Celsius on average, that some of the snow caps and glaciers are going to melt. It only stands to reason that that's going to happen. We also know that the ice caps and glaciers of the world provide a certain amount of fresh water because, for example, in the Rocky Mountains, there's going to be a certain amount of permanent ice caps up there, at least prior to global warming. There's a certain amount of permanent ice caps. The ice gets packed down in the winter when it's cold and snowing, and then the ice historically has not all melted all at one time in the springtime. It has melted gradually. This causes runoff. This causes a certain amount of fresh water to then be available to our ecosystems. The snow caps cause a certain amount of fresh water to be available to people. The snow caps cause a certain amount of fresh water to be available to agriculture and for crops. And all this is going away because of global warming. Meanwhile, we have a government that is asleep at the wheel and not caring about this, even though it has catastrophic effects. So if people think that the catastrophic effects of climate change are in the vague and unspecified future, that is a mistaken notion. The catastrophic effects of climate change have already been occurring. and it's just a question of how quickly these effects double and redouble over the course of time. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us that we have about 10 years to reduce our carbon output by about half, so as to keep global average temperatures from rising 2 degrees Celsius. And the thing is, if we stopped emitting carbon today, it's not as if global warming would then stop. If we stop emitting carbon today, global warming would continue for many, many years, because the carbon would remain, the carbon, once it's in the atmosphere, remains there for thousands of years. And that's one reason why we need to not only get busy with reducing the amount of carbon we emit, but also doing things like planting forests, because when trees are growing, they absorb carbon. For the same reason, we need to stop deforestation. And deforestation is occurring all around us. It's not just occurring in the Amazon. Deforestation is all over the world. Deforestation is occurring all around us. Deforestation is occurring in our county. And when we allow that to happen, we're doing the exact opposite of what needs to occur. What needs to occur is reforestation, where trees and forests grow and absorb carbon and store that carbon in the soils. So we need to look at what are the carbon sinks that are available to us, and we need to nurture and cultivate our carbon sinks instead of cutting down our carbon sink, cutting down our forest, and that kind of thing. So far, all I've done is talk about science and logic and common sense, and anything that we see in the media to the contrary is false and misleading and very damaging and destructive. So, some of the other effects of climate change are the effect on the oceans. So, carbon dioxide, when it's in the atmosphere, and when it combines with ocean water, it causes the ocean water to become more acid. As a result of that acidification, there's a great deal of destruction to the marine ecosystems. Also there's a warming of the oceans. So when the oceans warm, that causes a destruction of the oceans ecosystems. So part of this occurs in the coral reefs. So coral reefs are the source of about a fourth of the species in the oceans. And when the coral reefs die off due to acidification and due to warming of the oceans, then that causes a great deal of loss of the species in the oceans. So far we're just talking about science and logic. So other effects of climate change include droughts. So when there is global warming, then it causes more droughts because it causes heat waves. Global warming causes weather to be much more sporadic. That's why the farmers of the world in many places, they have longer dry spells and then heavier downpours, because it's not what it was before, which is a shorter dry spell and a steady rain, short dry spell, steady rain. That's what crops thrive on, and that's what ecosystems thrive on. But instead, we're getting longer dry spells and greater deluges. Another effect of climate change is the fact that you have hurricanes going to pick up more water. So when there's more heat in the atmosphere, When the air is warmer, then when you have a storm system moving over the water, then it picks up more water, and then when it makes landfall, it drops more water. That's why you have unprecedented rainfall associated with Hurricane Katrina, unprecedented waterfall associated with Hurricane Harvey in Houston, unprecedented rainfall associated with Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So you have not only hurricanes picking up more water to be dropped when they make landfall, but because of there's more energy in the atmosphere, you have greater winds resulting from the hurricanes. So these are real effects of climate change. And so far I'm just talking about science and logic and common sense. And when the media talks about that there are legitimate disagreements as to whether climate change is occurring or whether it's occurring due to natural causes or man-made causes, this is just irresponsible. And it's not just irresponsible to make it seem like there's a valid and legitimate controversy. It's also irresponsible to not be reporting it as often as they should. If climate change were given its proper amount of attention in the media, then it would be reported, on the front page of the New York Times every day. So, what do I mean? It would be reported. What do I mean? Climate change would be reported. I mean, if we all know it's happening, why do we need to be reminded of it over and over? Well, maybe we do need to be reminded of it over and over, but if the media were doing their job, they would be talking about solutions. They would be talking about solutions that we can implement at the level of Congress. They would be talking about solutions that people can implement at the local level. They were talking about solutions that we can implement in agriculture, because agriculture is a big problem. They would be talking about solutions that we can implement when it comes to mitigating the effects of climate change when it causes mass migration. So there's lots that could be said by the media when it comes to solutions to climate change, not only mitigating the problem, not only preventing climate change from occurring, but also dealing with the effects of climate change. This would be a front page every day on all the major newspapers if the media were responsible, but the media are not responsible because they're by their nature, they're not responsive to us, because the media doesn't exist for your benefit or for my benefit. The media exists to do the bidding of their sponsors. So you have to understand that the media is a business. They have to make a profit, and they're going to report what they report to the extent that it makes their owners and sponsors happy. Compounding that problem is the fact that the media, 95% of the media in this country is owned by 5 or 6 corporations that they have interlocking directorates, and they're scratching each other's backs. But the media doesn't exist for you and me. If the media is free or virtually free, then you're the product. If you're getting your media free, whether it's Facebook, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's CNN or Fox News or the Washington Post, if you're getting that virtually free, then you're the product. You are being delivered to the sponsors. So the media wants to take a relatively privileged, wealthy audience and deliver it to the sponsors. But in any event, the media is not going to be in business for very long if they make their sponsors unhappy by talking about how the oil companies should not be as profitable as they are because they're shifting their costs onto us. And they're polluting the waters, and they're causing oil spills, and they're polluting the air, polluting the water, impacting climate, giving us cheap oil, but it's not cheap in every respect. For one thing, we're subsidizing it. We're paying for it, especially when we pay the Pentagon, we're subsidizing oil. For another thing, we're subsidizing it in a way when we have negative health impacts due to the effects of a fossil fuel economy. So we're paying a great price for perpetuating the fossil fuel economy, and if the oil companies were paying the true cost of doing business, they wouldn't be profitable. You won't hear about this on the corporate media because the oil companies and all the Fortune 500, all the multinational corporations, including food, agribusiness, none of them would be profitable if they were paying the true cost of doing business. But you're not going to get this on the corporate media. So that's why we have to take matters into our own hands, and we have to learn how to spread the word, person to person, small group to small group, in our local communities. But especially we need to know who we can trust. Who can you trust to give you good information? Because you can't trust the corporate media. For example, the corporate media wants war with Iran because war gets good ratings. And because the corporate media is sponsored by the war machine, sponsored by the big insurance companies, sponsored by oil companies, sponsored by the multinational corporations that benefit when the U.S. is this 800-pound gorilla going all over the world, smashing whatever gets in its way. So where was I going with that, and how did I get off on that? But you have to know who you can trust. And I can give you a quick list of the people that I've come to trust over the course of time, people that don't have a particular agenda except to tell the truth about things. I mean, top of my list, Noam Chomsky, one of the people that I can trust to tell the truth. Naomi Klein, Chris Hedges, Peter Joseph. These are all people that you can look up. And there are more, like comedians like Jimmy Dore and Lee Camp. Even going back to George Carlin. I mean, yeah, there's a bit of spin and show business on that, but it's also, it goes against the prevailing narrative. It goes against the narrative that the media want you and I to embrace and believe in. So the media want you and I to embrace a narrative that says, the free market is about freedom. The media want you and I to embrace a narrative that says the U.S. is fighting for freedom in the world. The media want you and I to embrace a narrative that says everybody in America has a fair chance, that the deck is not stacked against you, or that it's an imperfect system, but it just is what it is, and it's America's great, and they want us to buy into this pro-establishment narrative. They want us to buy into the narrative that makes us docile, and they want us to be consumers. They don't want us. They certainly don't want us to be Democrats with a small d. They don't want us to be players in a democracy. They want us to buy into this narrative that says we live in a democracy. Because if we thought we didn't live in a democracy, we might start to agitate and change things. So we have these knockdown, drag-out debates on TV between Democrats and Republicans as if that's democracy. We're told to go vote and then go home, because a democracy is when you vote and you vote for a Democrat or Republican, and that's that, and it's not a perfect system, but it's the best we can do. What other narratives does the media and the power elites want us to buy into? But here's a question. The question is, if you have power, why would you give it up? If you have power, why would you give it up? If you have power, the last thing you want is genuine democracy. If you have power, the last thing you want is one person, one vote. I remember I was on Facebook, kind of in this group that, I don't know, it's one of these political groups, and somebody was saying, you know, in so many words, heaven help us if we give poor people too much power. It's like the story was about Venezuela, and it's like somebody had bought into the narrative that in Venezuela it's just these poor people that want to take everything the rich have earned. Like, heaven help us if poor people want to have equal rights, want to have equal power in a fundamentally democratic system. And I thought, well, one thing I didn't think to say, and it's just as well because I don't like to argue with people online, but one thing I could have said is like, yeah, like the story of history is poor people stealing from the rich. Yeah, the story of history is poor people stealing from the rich. Actually, the story of history is people with power, people with wealth, extracting everything they can from everybody else. But the other thing I thought when that came up is that in our educational system, we're taught to be suspicious of mob rule. You don't want mob rule. Well, where did that come from? The whole idea that there's such thing as mob rule, and if the mob takes over, it'll just be chaos, and the last thing we want is the rule of the mob. Well, that's a pro-establishment narrative. It's like we've had implanted in all along in our educational system and in the media, we've had implanted in our minds this idea that it would be a bad thing if we had actual democracy. It reminds me of Shays' Rebellion. You know, Shays' Rebellion was prior to the Constitution. In fact, Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts was this event that created a perceived need for a constitution. You need a strong federal government to be able to put down things like Shays' Rebellion. And maybe there's a different way of looking at Shays' Rebellion. Maybe Shays' Rebellion was actually democracy, and what put it down was a ruling aristocracy. Maybe, maybe not. I'm just inviting you to question what we've been taught, because if you have power, why would you give it up? Is it not true? Can we agree? Can we agree that our world, especially like the federal government, is controlled by a tiny group of people? Tiny group of people. Less than 1%. Because no matter who you vote for, they go to Washington, D.C., and they do the bidding of the big banks. No matter who you vote for, Democrat or Republican, they go to Washington, D.C., and they do the bidding of the war machine. Most people want peace. But we get a pro-war Democrat and a pro-war Republican, and those are our choices. Most people want our food system to be more oriented to the needs of consumers and less oriented to the needs of the agribusiness giants. We put way too much antibiotics in the feed of animals. That has negative effects. It creates strains of bacteria that are immune to the antibiotics. And almost everybody wants that to go away so we can have, but the food, livestock, the animal agriculture industry blocks any attempt to get that through. So no matter who you vote for, Democrat or Republican, at least the majority of them go to Washington, D.C. and do the bidding of the animal agriculture industry. We could go on and on. No matter who we vote for, Democrat or Republican, they go to Washington, D.C. At least the majority of them go to Washington, D.C. and do the bidding of oil companies. Most people want meaningful action on climate change. Most people want coal industry and oil industry to stop polluting our air and our water and impacting our climate. But no matter who you vote for, Democrat or Republican, they go to Washington, D.C. and do the bidding of oil companies and coal companies and fracking companies. Most people, if they had a knowledge of the facts, would want fracking to be banned. If you want to get the lowdown on fracking, I recommend a report by the Concerned Health Professionals of New York. It's easy to find if you Google it, Concerned Health Professionals of New York. There's about a 250-page document that really, it's just a devastating critique of the impacts, the health impacts, the social impacts of fracking. And yet we still have fracking. Not because the people want it, but because fracking companies want it. So no matter who you vote for, Democrat or Republican, they go to Washington, D.C., or they go to Frankfurt, or they go to City Hall in Louisville, and they're not willing to stand up to the oil companies, the fracking companies, the natural gas companies, the pipeline companies. So can we agree that we don't live in a democracy? And I'm not saying we live in a democracy that's imperfect. I'm saying we don't live in a democracy. And I'm not saying we can't get it back. The will of the people has some impact, but that's true in a totalitarian state. You could be a king or a dictator, and if the people get agitated, you're going to have to appease them and make them happy, or you're not going to be in power. So we can take back our democracy, but we don't currently live in a democracy. And this has been studied scientifically at places like Princeton. I think Princeton maybe has one of the leading political science departments. But if you look at public policy, does public policy reflect the wishes of the poor? No. Does public policy reflect the wishes of the middle class? No, not so much. Does public policy reflect the wishes of the upper third? Well, maybe, but only if you're in the top 10% or so. So that's what you would look at if you were looking for a scientific discussion of public policy, and whether or not public policy reflects public opinion, because in a democracy, public policy should reflect public opinion. Imperfectly, but there should be some correlation between public policy and public opinion. So anyway, the way we got started down this path is to look at the basics of climate change. and we'll continue to revisit that. I think it's important to look at the basics of climate change because we live in a world where it's easy to get distracted and stay distracted. And we're distracted by the media, which is owned by the people that own the world. And this is not sour grapes. It's just looking at the reality that we have so we can make a better world for ourselves and those that come after us. Thanks for joining me.